Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are going to begin with Minha on page 214. I'm so sorry to say that I didn't bring the page numbers down. It's page 226 or page 558 in the other Sidurim, I'm told. And you can be seated for now. Hopefully we will get a minyan in the next few moments so that we can do the full Torah service, but we'll keep you posted on that. So Rabbi Len will lead us beginning on page 214.
Thank you, Rabbi Schatz. Ashrei Shevetecha, Od Yalu Chasela, Ashrei Shekachalo, Ashrei Shadonai Elohav. Tehillat Adaber Pi, Vivareko Basar Shem Kodsho Le'olam Va'ed, V'anachnu Nevarech Ya, Me'atav Yad Olam, Hallelujah. Uva L'Tzion Goel, Asher Pesha B'Yakov Ne'um Adonai. V'yata Kadosh Yoshev Tilot Yisrael, V'karazel Zev Yamar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvot Melech Kol Haaretz Kivodo. V'tisaini Ruach V'eshma Acharai, Kol Ra'ash Gadol, Baruch Yevod Adonai Mimkomo. Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. Tzidcha tzedek liolam, Toratcha emet hitem. Baruch Adonai Yom Yom, Aslanu El Yeshua Selah. Le'amani zemelcha chavod v'lo yizah, Adonai Elohai. Leolam Odeka, Baruch HaGever Shefta Adonai, Adonai Mivtacho, Bitchu Adonai Deyad, Kivia Adonai Tzur Olamim, Vivdechu B'chayodei Shemecha, Ki lo zavta dorshech Adonai, Adonai Chafetz Among Tziko, Yagdil Torah V'yadir.
We don't have a minion yet, so
But oh, so close.
so close. Okay.
Oh, there's a Hika right on top. Joe Schwartz.
Yeah. Joe's here all the time. We're just taking a second to look to see if there are a few people just walking in the gate right now, who will make a minyan for us. We're close, but not there. The other option is that I could do a little bit of the teaching now and wait for a minyan and then continue. Did y'all have a minyan last week? Yeah? Great. What? I did. Yeah, that's true, but also my dad has been saying y'all since I was a little kid. It's not a new thing, but we can blame it on the South if we want. That's totally fine.
When I lived there, I liked it because they said in Hebrew we have a tab.
Right, exactly. Yeah. All right, well, Joel came back without anybody. All right, so maybe what I'll do, because we still have a little bit of time until we can't do Mincha anymore, maybe I'll actually start a little bit of the teaching, and then if we get too close to Mincha being over, we will move on without a full Torah service, and if not, we will read Torah when people arrive. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, all right. Be creative with our... All right. Oh, I need the microphone. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I feel like we already finished Mincha because I'm not usually up here without it. So a little bit funny that we just started. But this is a topic that I am particularly interested in really at all times, though Parashat Tazria and Mitsura, Parshiot I should say, Tazria and Mitsura really lend themselves to discussing this topic. So we're not going to talk specifically about either Parsha, and we're not going to specifically talk about any of the narrative that you it's really hard to call it narrative actually, but any of the laws or the matters that are at hand in these parshiot, but we are going to talk about the idea of Tame and Tahor. So Tame and Tahor are two words that when we think about the way in which our Torah has been translated, we've really done a poor job of translating Tame and Tahor. But the way in which we translate them has kind of created a system of its own for us to understand the different categories in a negative way and in a positive way, right? Tame being negative and Tahor being positive. However, it doesn't seem to me that that's actually what the Torah meant for them to be. They were just different categories, like asleep and awake, or up and down, right? Just two categories of being. And yet the way in which English turned these two words into vocabulary terms, we now think of them as negative and positive. So what is tameh typically? Okay, well, what does the word tameh typically mean? Impure or contaminated. Some people sometimes say unclean. And what is tahor? Pure. Great. So those are terrible words to use for these two things, not because they might not have defined the actual terms for what they were being used for in the Torah, but because when we think of unclean or contaminated, we think of, oh gosh, please stay away, this is really bad. And when we think of something that's pure, we think of a gem, or we think of something that is pure of heart, something that has no blemishes. And that's just not what pure means. Even when we're talking about tahor, right? You can be a person who has blemish, and then you go to the mikvah, and then you're tahor, but you still have had blemish in your life. It's just that now you've come to a state of tahor. You've come to a state of tehorah, of being pure. So we're not going to use the terms impure and pure because A, I think they're wrong, and B, they have within them connotations that really don't help us understand what the two categories are. Okay. So I'm going to translate for us Tameh and Tahor. Actually, you know what? Let's look at the verses first, given that right now we would be reading the Torah, and then I'll go back to the definitions. So you'll see here on your source sheet, whether you're in person or you have it from the website, that I've bolded, hopefully all of the words Tameh and all of the Tahor words. And now we have a minyan. So that is a cliffhanger. No, but he's here. He's right. I can see him. So just hold on to that thought. Tameh and Tahor, really exciting intro. And we will read Torah now. The Torah service can be found on page 218. And I'll come back and we'll do the rest. Great, that worked out perfectly. Awesome.
You want to announce the page?
I think I just did. 218, right?
But I just.
Oh, 270. Page 217 for Chatzi Kaddish.
Yikadav yikadash shemei rabba v'yamad divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayedecho beit Yisrael b'galav izman kariv v'imru amen Yehi shmei rabba mavorach le'olam u'me'ol maya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitrama v'yitnasei Vitadar vitla vitalal shmei kedusha brichu leila min kol berchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata demiram bialma v'imru amen v'ani tvilati lachadonai ratzon Elohim barov chasecha neni v'emed yishecha v'yehi bin sar almost Vayhi bin Saron vayomer Moshe, kumarana ve'avutsoy vecha ve'anusu misanecha mipanecha, ki mitzion tete torah dvarana mirushalayim, baruch shanatan Torah l'mo Yisrael bigdu. Shatov. Gadlu l'Adonai iti, Rama Mashema yachdav. Uvaretz.
Sure. Do you want to tell us?
What?
Do you want to tell us?
Oh, sure.
Then yeah, he can zoom.
I promise I'll give it back.
No problem. All right, we are going to read from Parashat Mitsura, which can be found in your Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 660. And if you're in a non-Eitz Chaim, it's just the beginning of Parashat Mitsura, Leviticus chapter 14, verse 1. Does anybody want it first, Aaliyah? Fran, you want it? Yeah, yeah.
Zipporah
Zipporah bat
Mordechai V'Sara.
Mordechai v'Sara l'Yarisha Marush and Tatra l'Moisra b'Kdushato.
Atem Rabekim Balachem Chaim Kochem Hayom.
Vatem Arivim Alachem Haim Kochem Hayom.
Vaydaber.
Baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch Hu et Adonai.
Baruch Adonai Barak.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Barak Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vaydaber Adonai Moshe Lemor. Zot tiyeh Torat HaMitzorah b'yom taharato v'huval HaKohen. V'yatzo HaKohen el michutz l'machane v'ra HaKohen. V'nei nirpa nega HaTzorat min HaTzarua v'tziva HaKohen v'lakach lamin mitaher shtei tziporim v'chayot v'tahorot v'eitz erez u'shni talat v'ezov v'tziva HaKohen v'shachat HaTzipor ha'echat el kli cheres al mayim chayim.
close relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam atah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai
Shmo.
noten haTorah.
Amen. Second Aliyah? What? Sherry? Oh, Sherry, go ahead. I thought I saw a hand. Let me move this over here and then we can get the Aliyah. Ta'amad. Zahavamina. Bat Binyamin. Vereza Laliyah Sheni.
Page 661, verse 6.
Where are we? Oh, here we are. Baruch Adonai Hamvarach. Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Amen.
Amen. Et hatzipor achaya yikach ota v'et eit eretz v'et eit ha'eretz v'et shni hatolat v'et hoizo v'tabal otam v'et hatzipor achaya b'dam hatzipor hashichuta al hamayim hachayim v'hiza al hamitaher minha צרעת שבע פעמים, ותיארו ושילח את הציפור החיה על פני השדה, וכיבס המטהר את בגדיו, וגילח את כל שערו, ורחץ במים וטהר, ואחר יבוא אל המחנה וישב מחוץ לאוהלו 7 ימים. והיה ביום השביעי יגלח את כל שערו, את ראשו ואת זקנו, ואת גבות עיניו, ואת כל שערו יגלח, וכיבס את בגדיו, ורחץ את בשרו במים וטהר.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen. Third Aliyah. Going once. Okay, great. Yeah, great. Ya'amad harav zev leib ben dov ber ubracha l'aliyah shlishi.
Page 661, verse 10.
Baruch hu et Adonai Hamvarach. Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
אמן, וביום השמיני ייקח 2 כבשים תמימים וכבשה אחת בת שנתה תמימה ו13 עשרונים. סולת בנך בלולה בשמן ולוג אחד שמן והעמיד הכהן המטהר את האיש המטהר ואותם לפני אדוני פתח אוהל מועד, ולקח הכהן את הכבש האחד, והקריב אותו לאשם וידלוק השמן, והניף אותם תנופה לפני אדוני.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet V'chayei Olam Nata B'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen.
Yeshakov to you.
Ya'amad. Someone feel comfortable lifting? Ya'amad. Mark? No. Okay. Want to get a chair? If you're able to do so, please rise. Vezot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai beyad Moshe.
מחזיקים בה, ותומכיה מאושר. עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה, ותומכיה מאושר. דרכיה דרכי נועם, וכל צבאותיה שלום. דרכיה דרכי נועם, וכל צבאותיה שלום. יין עין
Do you want to do an El Male for your grandmother? Oh, okay. Keyword name? So Rabbi Len has been leading services in honor of his, in memory of, but also in honor of his grandmother's yahrzeit. And so I just asked if he would like to do an El Male in her memory. So now I just have to find the El Male for him to be able, here we go. Do you want to sing it? You want me to sing it? Okay. That's very sweet. Exactly. I always think about that. When people at this, back in the day, never thought that a woman would sing them an El Male. Okay. El Male Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hametzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Knafei HaShechina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim u'Tahorim, Kezohar Ki HaMazhirim, Lenishmat Leah bat Zlata שהלכה לעולמה, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתה, הנאה בעל הרחמים, הסתיריה בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתה, אדוני הוא נחלתה, ותנוח בשלום על משכבה, ונאמר amen. Is there anything you want to share about your grandmother? A memory or something? You can if you want, yeah.
So my grandmother, if she was alive today, would be 120. She died in 1976, so it's 46 years. She was very athletic. You might not expect an old lady from Kiev to, but she took me swimming where we lived. She was born outside in Kiev, and we lived in Ottawa at the time, and that's where she raised my mom and my late aunt. And where we lived, there was an indoor swimming pool. So my bubby took me swimming. It's like, usually you think, she loved hanging out with the girls. You know, she'd play, who knows, I thought it was poker, but I think it was gin rummy, my oldest cousin asked. She was an excellent balabusta. She was a great host. She and my grandfather, my Zeta, really made a center for our family and my aunt and my two first cousins. And she really would have been really pleased. She died before my brother and I were ordained as rabbis. And my Zeta missed it by 2 years. Like that would have been the ultimate naches for him. But they created a home environment for our extended family that, you know, is just what we needed. And so I'm very grateful.
We'll continue with the Torah Service on page 221.
Ya hallelujah, Shem Adonai, ki niskav shemo levado, hodo hallelujah.
Vayarem keren leyamo, tehila lechol chasida, livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah, le David mizmor,
Mihuza melech hakavod, Adonai tzvaru melech hakavod sela, uvnucha yomar. עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה, ותומכיה מאושר, דרכיה דרכי נועם, וכל נתיבותיה שלום. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם.
Chatzi Kaddish into the whispered Amidah, bottom of page 222.
יקדל ויקדש שמי רבה, ויעמד דברכותי, וימליך מלכותי, בחייך וביומך. ובחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב, אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעולמי. יתברך וישתבח, ויתבר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי קדושו בריחו, לעילם מכל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירם בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'elei avotenu v'imotenu elei Avraham elei Sarah v'elei Yitzchak v'elei Yaakov Rivka v'elei Yaakov v'elei Rachel v'elei Leah el gadol gibor v'nara el elyon Gomel chasadim tovim v'konei hakol v'zechecha ze avot v'imahot u'mevi goel livnei v'nehem l'man shemo b'yahava melech ozir Mashiach magen Baruch atah Adonai magen Avraham uvokei tzara אתה גיבור לעם אדוני, מחי מתים אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים רחמים רבים, שמח נפלים ורופא חולים מתיר אסורים. ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר מקמך בעל גברות מי דומה לך, מלך מימים חיים מצמיח ישועה, ונאמנתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים. נקדש את שמך בעולם כשם מקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב היד נביאך וכרזה אל זה ויאמר, קדוש קדוש קדוש, אדוני צבאות מלוך כל הארץ כבוד. קדוש קדוש קדוש, אדוני צבאות מלוך הארץ כבודו, למתם ברוך יאמרו. ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו דברי קודשך כתוב לאמור. ימלוך אדוני לעולם, מלכי ציון לדור ודור, הללויה, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, לנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש. בשבחך אלוהינו, מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד, כי המלך גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הקדוש. אתה אחד ושמך אחד, ומי כעמך ישראל, גוי אחד בארץ. תפארת גדולה ועטרת ישועה, יום מנוחה קדושה לעמך נתת, אברהם יגע, יצחק ירנן, יעקב ובניו ינוחו בו, מנוחת אהבה ונדבה, מנוחת אמת ואמונה, מנוחת שלום והשלווה והשקט והבטח, מנוחה שלמה שאתה רוצה בה, יכירו בניך וידעו כי מאיתך היא מנוחתם. ועל מנוחתם יקדישו את שמך, אלוהינו ולאבותינו ואמותינו, רוצה במנוחתנו, קדשנו במצוותיך, ותן חלקנו בתורתך, סבנו מטובך, ושמחנו בישועתך, וטהר ליבנו לעבדך באמת, והנחילנו בני אלוהינו באהבה ורצון שבת קודשך. וינוחו ישראל מקדשי שמך, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש השבת. רצה אדוני אלוהינו בימך ישראל תפילתם, ושדה את העבודה לדביר ביתך, תפילתם באהבה תקבל ברצון, ותהי לרצון תמיד עבודת ישראל עמך. אלוהינו ולאבותינו ואמותינו, יעלה ויבוא ויגע ויראה, וירצה וישמע. יפקד ויזכר זיכרוננו פיקדוננו, וזיכרון אבותינו ואמותינו, וזיכרון משיח בן דוד עבדך, וזיכרון ירושלים עיר קודשך, וזיכרון כל עמך בית ישראל לפניך, לפלטה לטובה, לכן וחסד רחמים על חיים ושלום ביום ראש החודש הזה. זוכרנו אדוני אלוהינו בו לטובה, פוקדנו בו לברכה, ויושענו בו לחיים. ודבר ישועה ורחמים, חוס וחנינו ורחם עלינו והושיענו, כי לך עינינו, כי המלך חנון ורחום אתה. ותחזינה עינינו בשובך לציון ורחמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, המחזיר שכינתו לציון. מודים אנחנו לך, שאתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ולאבותינו ואמותינו, אלוהי כל בשר, יוצאנו צור יוצא בראשית, ברכות והודות לשמך הגדול והקדוש, על שהחייתנו וקיימנו כן תחיינו ותקיימנו ותאסוף גלותנו לחצות קודשך, לשמור חוקיך ולעשות רצונך, לעבדך בלבב שלם, על שאנחנו מודים לך, ברוך אל ההודאות. ועל כולם יתברך ויתרומם שמך מלכנו תמיד לעולם ועד, וכל החיים ידעוך סלע, ולא את שמך באמת האל ישועתנו ועזרתנו סלע. ברוך אתה אדוני, הטוב שמך וחנה אל ההודות. שלום רב על ישראל עמך, ועל כל יושבי תבל תשים לעולם, כי אתה הוא מלך אדון לכל השלום. וטוב בעיניך, לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. ברוך אתה אדוני, המברך את עמו ישראל ושלום. Yikada vikada shemei rabba v'yamadi v'chirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon v'yomechon u'chayedachol beit Yisrael b'galav izman kari v'imru amen. Me'omaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitraman v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalal shmei kedusha brichu Leila min kol berchata v'shirata tushbrachata v'nechamata damiram b'yalma v'imru amen. Tikabel tzatahonu v'atahon dechoisel kadamahon divishmaya v'imru amen. Yehi shalom rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu v'al Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'al yeshei tevel v'imru amen. Aleinu l'shabeach l'Adonai. Lo taken olam b'malchut Shaddai. Kakatu b'toratecha Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'amar v'yadan l'melech al kol haaretz b'yam hahu yihye Adonai echad u'shmo echad. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah. V'yalma divra chirute v'yamlech malchute b'chayechon v'yomechon u'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'izman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabbah mevarach le'olam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitboar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shemei dekudasha b'richu. Le'ila min kol berchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata tamiram b'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yeshvei tevel v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Thank you, thank you.
Grandmother, who I'm sure would be very proud that you led services and took an aliyah and all those things. If everyone wants to just get a little snack, we'll go back into the learning that we started a little preview for a few moments ago, and we'll begin in about 5 minutes. And hello to the Fields Myers and to Cantor Chorney and to the Backracks and to the, well, I just see Warren, but maybe Deb's there too, and Tybal and to Joe and to AJ and to whoever user is. Lovely to see you all. Oh, no, it's fine. Yeah, it's during COVID, it's been hard. We often struggle for Minyan, but we made it. So no worries. Yeah. I just kind of define the terms, but yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, no. Yes, years ago. Yeah. Yeah. I might have it as a PDF. It was written years and years ago. Yeah. Right. So if I have it, I can. Yeah, great. into it. I know. I just don't know. I mean, every time I try to do it, people didn't come. So I just don't know how to restart it. So this service will remain outside for a while because we're always going to have something outside. So when this is the only thing happening, the default will be to be outside. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see if the summer allows us to change that. But for right now, we're going to at least have one thing outside. So this is the one thing. Yeah. Correct. So today we had library minute outside, but the clergy service Hamalat was inside. So and I was just telling Sherry, it was the first Hamalat we've ever done in the sanctuary, which was pretty crazy. Yeah, ever. But it's just it was with people. We've done it with computers, but we've never done it with people. Yeah, it was really awesome. We didn't, but Rabbi Klickfeld mentioned that it was a Shechianu moment, but he didn't. Yeah. All right, take another minute, everyone, and then we'll begin again. Is it tomorrow that's starting? Yeah.
That's what Tom told me. It's starting at
Right.
Sunday morning.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, we haven't had it back in person in a long time, so that's great. Minyan, Sunday morning Minyan. Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember. Because I was in the South when all of it changed, I don't remember. All right, let's get back into this a little bit. I'm gonna kind of re-intro, not as long as I did a few minutes ago, but just for those of you who just joined or who came onto the field to make us into a minyan, you missed the intro, so I'll give you the intro again. So we just read, Joel really just read Parashat Mitsura for us. This past week was Parashat Tazria, and both parshiot, very often they're put together, but both parshiot talk about bodily emissions and blood and gore and gross things, or we call them gross. I actually don't know if they were considered gross back in the day, but just things that our bodies do that could make us into these categories of tameh or tahor. And what we discussed a few moments ago was this idea that English has turned tameh and tahor into a negative and a positive. Tameh being negative and tahor being positive. Tameh being unclean or impure or unfit, and then tahor being pure and ready and clean. And truthfully, those two words in English have connotations that the two words in Hebrew really don't have. So we're going to discuss these two different categories and what tameh and tahor could truly mean. Just as a reminder, we have these states of tameh and tahor still in 2022. These are not things that have gone away with the temple. It's just that they mean less. And what do I mean by that? When you are tameh in today's world, if you are someone who practices the laws of Nida, that might mean that you are not coming close sexually to your husband. But for the most part, tameh is just our general state of being in the world. Most people, present company included, are just tameh because we do things in the world and then don't go to the mikvah after them, right? We sit on tahara teams, or we don't practice the laws of Nida, or we creepy crawly things crawl on us, and certain creepy crawly things can make us tameh because they are tameh, and we don't go to the mikvah. So if one of those things has happened to you in your life and you haven't gone to the mikvah, then you are in a perpetual state of tumah, of being tameh. Again, if we translate that to English, that sounds really bad, right? Everyone is thinking to themselves, well, wait a second, maybe I should have gone to the mikvah then because I need to be tahor. Well, no, you're not unclean. You're just in a state of having lived life. And tahor is, back in the day when we had the temple, tahor meant you had taken care of going to the mikvah so that you could go to the temple. We don't have the temple today. So there's really nothing in our lives for which you need to be tahor, except for, again, the laws of Nida. So if you practice those, what I'm about to say is a little bit of a caveat. But when you come to shul, we don't ask you for your vaccination card and whether or not you're tahor, right? You come to shul. It doesn't matter to us whether you are in a state of tameh or tahor. And the understanding is probably that you are in a state of tameh. Now, again, we don't care, right? That's not something that we are checking off in a box to make sure that you are tahor when you are doing certain acts in life. People might choose to find themselves in a state of tahor and go to the mikvah. Some examples, right before you take on some big life cycle. So brides often will go to the mikvah, grooms also, but people getting married might go to the mikvah before they get married. A friend of mine is becoming a rabbi in May, and he just told me that he's going to the mikvah right before he's ordained. There are moments in life where you might choose to go to the mikvah and deem yourself tahor. But again, later that day or the next day, you're probably going to enter into a state of tumah just by living life. So the tahor state is really one that is a spiritual uplift in today's day, not necessarily a way in which you need to be checked to do something ritually. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So we're going to look at these verses here, and I took pieces from different parts of Tazria and Mitsura just to get my point across. We're not going to read so deeply into the text itself, but I just want you to see how the words tameh and tahor are used. So if you're on the source sheet, we're on the side that has all the Torah verses, and then we'll turn over to the commentaries in a moment. So this is Leviticus chapter 12, verse 1. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moses, saying, Daber al b'nei Yisrael lemor, Isha ki tazria leyalda zachar, vetam'a shiv'at yamim, keyamei nidat dota titma. So you're going to, right, God spoke to Moses and said, you're going to tell Bnei Israel, speak to the Israelite people, when a woman in childbirth gives birth to a male, right, gives birth to a baby boy, she will be tameh. She will become tameh. I'm purposefully not saying what the translation says, which is unclean, because it's just not what it means. She will be tameh for 7 days. And she will continue to be tameh in this time of her, it's calling it menstrual infirmity. Again, not particularly nice, but basically while she's still bleeding. So while she's in Nida, which we're not going to talk about Nida right now, but if you're interested in Nida, I'm also very interested in Nida. Happy to talk about it anytime, except for right now. Uvayom hashmini yimo basar alato. You're going to give him a circumcision on the 8th day. We all know that. Ushloshim yom ushloshet yamim. It's very hard to read this in this light, sorry. Teshev bitmei tahara, bechol kodesh lo tig'a, ve'el hamikdash lo tavo ad mloat yamei tahara. So she's gonna remain in this state of what's called, it says here, blood purification. I'm trying to say this nicer. B'damei tahara, like in this time where she is bleeding in tahara, for 30 days she shall not touch any consecrated thing, right? She can't come close to anything that is kadosh, nor enter the sanctuary. Again, we don't do this today, obviously, until her period of purification. They're not using the word period here like menstrual period, though obviously they're connected, of tahara is completed. If she bears a female, she will be tameh for 2 weeks, as during her menstruation, and she will remain in a state of blood. Okay. We're not going to go into whether or not it's fair that for a boy it's one thing and for a girl it's another thing, but you can see here how Tame and Tahor are used, right? Tame is when she just gave birth, and therefore she is still, I've never given birth, but from what I understand, she is still bleeding. And then there is this state of Tahor, where she can find herself outside of that state, whether it is for the time after a boy or for the time after a girl. So what do Tame and Tahor mean here? What are they trying to claim in this space here of this narrative? Yeah, what does tameh mean in this particular narrative? So when we're talking about a woman being tameh after giving birth, what is that state for her, for the baby, for the people around her? What does that mean for her? Great. So Fran just said it limits her behavior, right? And what she's able to do, probably with her husband, right? Everything spoken about here in the Torah is heterosexual, so I'm just going to go with that for a moment. Right? Great. Great. So what she can touch, who she can touch, where she can go, because this idea of tum'ah, which we see in last week's parsha, actually, in terms of sara'at, can spread, right? Anything that is touched becomes tameh as well. So anything that she touches after having given birth is now tameh. Again, if in your mind, because we've been programmed to think of tameh as unclean, you're thinking, oh, if she touches the table, it's now unclean. But that's not what it means. It just means that it's now become in a state of tum'ah, of being tameh. What else does it say about her? Great. It has a particular time frame, right? Which, again, though we won't get into it, seems to be different for having a boy versus having a girl. There's a beginning and an end. Great. Yeah.
It seems like it's not only who she can touch and who she can't, but who she can associate with.
Great.
Like it's implied, but I just wanted to flesh that out, because it means like she's like way over there and we're over here, so it isn't even like with any precautions, like COVID-related ones. She just can't be with us.
Great. So it seems to be saying that she is being removed from certain people to not interact with, right? And what Rabbi Len just said is, it's similar though different than COVID in terms of saying like, you go over here and we're going to all be over here, but that there is a certain understood distance or isolation even for a woman who is tameh right after giving birth. Joe, I'm happy to call on you. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to hear you. So try it and let's see.
It works.
Oh, great. Perfect.
I was going to say it also, this is kind of in another vein, but also she's in a certain state of vulnerability and danger just because certainly back in those times, childbirth presented a very serious, risk. There's a certain inherent danger because you don't have a medical facility, you don't have any of, the hygiene or sanitary facilities that are involved in childbirth today.
Great. So that actually points, I don't have to repeat it because everyone could hear you. That actually goes straight into what I was just about to mention, which is this can sound, if we're choosing to go with the more understood translations that I think are wrong of Tame and Tahor, this makes us think that Tameh is a time for a woman to be put aside. And as Joe just pointed out, that could be very dangerous. It could also be unhelpful, especially if you've just given birth. But I want us to think for just a second about potentially what beauty could come out of this. When we talk about Nida, this is one of the things that women who are trying to reclaim the mitzvah of Nida talk a lot about. That when men taught about the Halacha of Nida, the way of, does everybody know what Nida is? I keep talking about. Okay. Nida is a time according to a woman's menstrual cycle, that as soon as she begins her period, she is no longer allowed to touch her husband, sexually or otherwise, nor is she allowed to do other kinds of things like pass him food or make his bed, because those are seen as sexualized. Many jokes have been made about whether or not, that's just for a man to take on these tasks for once in a while. But also the idea of Nida is that of separation. And then a woman goes to the mikveh after a certain number of days following her period, and then she can resume romantic relationship and sexual activity with her partner. So what I was about to say about Nida is that some people talk about this idea of Tuma as being a separation in a negative way, but it also could be something that's seen as positive. The mother is allowed to be with her baby. Right? She's just not allowed to come close to anything else or touch anything else. So though obviously that would be hard and not helpful, right? There would not be other people around to potentially help her with the baby. Could it be that this was also a designated time for her to bond with a new life, with a new child? And that our Torah was trying to come up with ways to allow that spiritual connection to be one that could not quite literally be touched. Yeah, Len. Sorry, Rabbi Len.
Many years ago, as a rabbi in Boston, a young girl studying for bat mitzvah shows this.
Yeah.
And we rabbis say, okay, summarize. Kids go home and find a verse that really resonates.
Yeah.
So then the next week she came up with this difference in time. She said, okay, go back home, Rebecca, and same name, but and when she came back, like you, she wasn't emphasizing the difference in time.
Mm-hmm.
But apropos what you just said, she said, when you're going to a new stage in life, I guess assuming it was the first child,
Mm-hmm.
parenthood is like another child,
Mm-hmm.
you just need time
Mm-hmm.
to assimilate this new reality and appreciate what it is and prepare for what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been quoting her for 26 years. I was so worried she focused on like the misogynist aspect of
Mm-hmm.
the Torah instead. I thought it was so insightful for a 13-year-old to say you just need time.
Right.
Mindfulness wasn't a word in 96.
Sure.
I understood it.
So Rabbi Len just mentioned that when he was working with a bat mitzvah student, before I even had my bat mitzvah, that she mentioned that this was a time for someone when going through a transition in life and potentially a moment of milestone, that time is needed to just have that separation, to figure out who you are, to be able to take time for yourself, not have the noise, the crowds, the pushing of others onto you. It reminds me, having nothing to do with Tame and Tahor, it reminds me of what I typically say to a bride and groom right before a bride is veiled for the chuppah. And that is that, we often talk about how it comes from Isaac and Rebecca, and how Rebecca veiled herself when she saw Isaac, and why is that, etc. And I always talk about how I think that Rebecca was so taken with him, and she needed to remember that there were still parts of her that needed to be kept, right? That in partnership, we have to remember that the person hopefully fell in love with their partner because of who they were, not because of who the partner might have changed to be with you. So when you veil yourself at a wedding, or when your husband veils you at a wedding, there's this idea of keeping that which is yours, that which is your identity, that which makes you who you are, close to you, and reminding yourself of who you are without needing everybody else's interpretation around. So I want us to think about Tame and Tahor. We're going to go into a few more modern interpretations, but Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, believe it or not, and you can all tell Rabbis Kligfeld and Lucas that this was a bad hazing model. But my first sermon at Temple Beth Am, formal sermon, I had taught a lot, but my first formal sermon at Temple Beth Am was for Parashat Tazria Mitsura, and which is just, cruel and unusual punishment, but here I am, so I guess it went okay. And I went to Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, who was my teacher at the time, and I asked him to help me with this sermon that I was already writing about the words Tame and Tahor. And what he said has resonated with me and has made me think of Tame and Tahor differently ever since, and I hope that it'll help us as well get through these next few commentaries here. He says that Tame, I just wanted to make sure I got it right. The Tame is ritually unprepared, and that Tahor is ritually ready. Okay? He explains that a new and challenging way of understanding Tame and Tahor is that instead of as opposites, think of the two words as different states of purity. Right? If we're going to use the word pure, just think of them as different states of a continuum of purity. People who are Tame do not need to sacrifice because they're already in the state of holy wonderment. If you've performed tahara on a dead body, you were in a state of holy wonderment and connection that the person at home who doesn't know that the tahara is even happening has no connection to. So even though your state of, quote, purity has potentially changed because you've been in contact with a dead body, you are on a higher level of holy wonderment and spiritual connection than someone who has not. That's not a negative, that's a positive, at least for me. So when you think of Tahor, that's a person who has sat at home in their room, potentially doing wonderful things like reading Torah or taking care of their children, etc., but they're not out in the world doing things that would potentially make them tameh. What is one of the number one things that the Torah talks about in terms of tameh? Having sexual relationships with your partner to have children. If everybody stayed in a perpetual state of tahor, there would be no humans. So you have to be in a state of tameh to be able to live life, quite literally, to create life and live life. So tameh is not unclean, it's just life lived. And tahor is you needing to remind yourself that you need a connection to continue that living. So when there was a temple, you would go to the mikvah, You would then go to the temple, you would make a sacrifice, you would hopefully feel some kind of rush of spiritual engagement, and then you would go out in the world and you would become tameh because you would do something that was wonderful for the world. And then the cycle would start all over again. So if I were to go back to the rabbis of the Talmud, really even of just Jewish law in general, or of whoever put together our Torah, and say, I think you just wrote it wrong. I don't think it really has anything to do with uncleanliness. It has to do with these are categories of people who are living life, who are aware of their bodies, who know what's going on. And then here's a category of people who need a reminder, who need to be able to have that connection to God a little bit more closely. Okay. I gave you 3 different modern commentaries. Because of the time, we're only going to read 1.5, maybe 2, because then I want to also hear your thoughts on this before we close. So I want us to read Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg's here. She says, she agrees with me. We talked about, no, I'm just kidding. We didn't talk, but she agrees. Oh, hi, Mike. Good to see you. Unclean is the wrong word for tameh. Agreed. It implies dirty or moral badness. A better translation for tameh would be everyday state, and for tahara would be elevated state. Back in the day, most people were in an everyday state most of the time. The elevated state was what you needed to go to the temple in Jerusalem. Things that could make you, quote, everyday state, or tameh, generally had to do with death or not life. Disease, contact with a dead body, missed baby-making opportunities. How you got from everyday to elevated depended on the thing. Sometimes time did the job, sometimes ritual washing like a mikvah. With contact with the dead, though, there was a whole ritual with an unblemished red heifer involved. We are all tameh now. We are all, which, by the way, is a generalization. That's not necessarily true. If someone went to the mikvah, you are not tameh, but we assume that most people living in our world today are tameh. We are all in the everyday state. Nobody's done the red heifer thing for a couple thousand years, and there's no temple to go to, so it doesn't matter. These are her words, by the way. I do think it matters, but I don't think that it is the same kind of implication for Tame and Tahor. I think it matters because I think it matters what state of spiritual closeness we are in. It just doesn't matter in terms of ritual observance what state we are in. Okay, so that's Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. I want to read one more, and then I want to hear your thoughts. Abigail Pograbin, who many of you probably either heard or were at the class that I did with her. Also, Cantor Chorney did a did a class with her before the high holidays last year. She talked about her book, The Jewish Year, which everybody should read. It's really a fantastic book. And she says about Tame and Tahor, the directives are so particular, they're so specific, and that's what we are experiencing right now every day. This is how you wash your hands thoroughly. This is how to separate and sterilize your groceries. This is how long the virus lives on a box or on a cardboard. And also, this is a reminder whether or not our ancestors knew what was coming, that in a certain way it never dies. The idea of plagues, of pandemics, of infection, of someone being a leper or diseased, it's the minutia of the sterilization. In order to come back, here are the things you need to do. So she's connecting it, obviously, to COVID. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about her take, she's specifically talking about Sara'at, so she's commenting on last week's Parsha. But what I think is so interesting about this idea of Tameh and Tahor and preparing yourself is that really, if you are in a state of tameh, you need not think as much about that preparation. But if you have become tahor, it might be that you're not doing enough to think about how to go back into the world. It might be that you're still staying home because you're scared, and potentially rightfully so, right? There's no judgment around that. But is it that you're staying home because it's comfortable or because it's not safe? Are you not going out back into the world to become tameh again because you are worried for your safety? or because you're just not sure what's going to happen. And so what she's saying here is that there are things that we need to do to come back, and there are things that we need to do to make ourselves tameh again, which is a very different narrative than what the Torah says, which is how can we create ourselves tahor again? So that's the end of my spiel here, though there's more that you can look at that I gave to you. But I'm very curious to hear what people think about this new interpretation of Tame and Tahor, and then we'll go into Mariv. Any thoughts? I saw lots of heads nodding, which is always good. It's like, oh, people like this better than me telling them that Tameh is unclean. Totally. So there are the question was, are there communities that specifically still observe this? When it comes to Nida, yes. Now, Nida is one of these things that, your rabbi isn't going to ask you when you show up to shul, did you go to the mikveh after your period? It's still a very private thing. In fact, when you learn the laws of Nida, one of the first laws that you learn is that even your husband isn't allowed to tell you what to do for the laws of Nida. It's up to the woman. So the woman has to learn the laws. She's the one who determines how, when, if she goes to the mikveh. It's not even the husband's job to be part of that. Obviously, in egalitarian homes, it very often is a partnership, and even potentially the man goes to mikveh as well. But it's not a rabbi's job to say, oh, you shouldn't be holding your husband's hand today. Didn't you have your period 7 days ago? So there are communities for which it is important, but there still aren't communities that are using it as like a checklist item to participate. Yeah.
I also think it's used as a way to keep women down. Certainly, people say a woman shouldn't be a rabbi, shouldn't officiate at a ceremony.
Yep.
Because she might be having her period at that time.
Right.
We think that's disgusting.
Right.
That's sort of an orthodox view of this. I appreciate what you're saying, but I think we have to get rid of that notion that women can't do the same things men do because God forbid they might be having their period.
Right. So what Joel just said was that there are also communities in which Nida is used as a way to keep women kind of away from ritual because they might be Nida, right? They might be on their period or during that time where they haven't yet gone to the mikveh. And so it keeps women separate from those rituals that men are allowed to have. When we were learning about this in school, one of the things that I forget which teacher, unfortunately, or I would quote them, but one of the things that our teacher said was, well, if we were going to be so worried about bodily function and who's going to be on the bima, then men should go to the mikveh every morning, right? Because there is science around. I feel like I'm teaching a sex ed class now. There is science around, males having seminal emissions and most evenings, whether in their control or out of their control. And therefore they should go to the mikveh every morning. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud got rid of that because it was too cumbersome on their schedules. So that and the idea of Nida seem to be pretty similar in terms of just bodily function and emission. But yes, as Joel's saying, one of the ways in which women were told they shouldn't be on the bima, they shouldn't touch the Torah, which, by the way, a Torah cannot become tameh, so any woman can touch a Torah without any concern, that it's because potentially she could be on her period and we wouldn't know, and did she not go to the mikveh, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, that is unfortunately still happening in 2022. Yeah, Mike.
I've read a commentary on this
Yeah. Yeah.
and the rabbi took the concept of Amir being like this concept of being resetting. In other words, resetting, and I was wondering comment on that about how that fit into
Tameh as a resetting.
In other words,
Yeah. Yeah.
The idea that what is the real reason why you're not going out?
Mm-hmm.
Are you in a static position?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Reset and move forward?
Hmm. It's interesting. I would almost think that Tahor would be the resetting, because Tameh seems to be kind of the more mundane, the more like active part of life. So I would have to look into what they meant by resetting. I'm actually not sure that I would understand how to translate Tameh as resetting, except for the fact that I guess it gets you back into life. And so maybe that is the resetting. Fran, do you have an idea?
It's a state, not a transition.
Go ahead. Mm. Interesting. So Fran's saying that maybe it's a parallel to Kadosh and Chol, which is, for those of you who were at the Sunshine Wedding last week, I talked about the idea of Kadosh meaning separation. So it's actually really interesting to talk about that, especially with this, right? That Kadosh, the idea of holiness actually means to separate. And so how do we make certain aspects of our lives holy because we've separated them out from the mundane pieces? Fascinating. Thank you for that. Warren, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Hi, I sure can.
Okay. Okay. Just one interesting point is that in the Hasidic community, a lot of men go to the mikveh every day.
Right.
For the very reason that you mentioned.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
The other thing that I think is something to consider is that what is a mikveh? A mikveh is a natural body of water.
Mm-hmm.
So like the ocean. So
Yeah.
what we're saying is that going into a natural body of water is the thing that makes you pure or tahor. So I think that's something to think about.
Okay, fantastic. So this idea that if you are tameh and looking to be in a state of tahor, that as Warren said, you go to a natural body of water, right? We're not asking you to go on a major hike and do a this and sacrifice a that, right? It's not something that's difficult. You actually go into something very natural to then reclaim that state of tahor, which I agree, Warren, is something to definitely think about and bring into our consciousness around these states of living. So I want to just, there's no end to this. There's no way of saying that there's this is the nugget to learn from this, right? But I think that the thing to recognize is that we should be proud to live in a state of tameh. We should be proud to be people who want to be tameh so that we can recognize the moments of tahor. And that we can figure out ways that in living life, even if it is putting us into a state of tameh, that the act itself is one of creating tahor, of creating tahora, of creating that purity. When we do tahara for a body, we become tameh, but the body becomes tahor. So we are living to be able to do a mitzvah that is going to make someone else have holy uplift of their soul. So this is dying, as you can tell, and I know, but they can't hear me if I don't have a microphone. We're going to do Bir Kana Mazon. I'm going to figure out the microphone situation, and then we're going to do Mariv. Birkat Hamazon. I'll start and then someone else can do the Zima. Shir Hamala Beshu. Thank you. All right, we will continue with Mariv on page 264. If you're able to do so, please rise. והוא רחום יכפר אבל לא ישחית והרבה להשיבה פה ודרכו חמתו אדוני יושיע מלך יעננו ויום קורנו ברכו את אדוני המבורך ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד ברוך את אדוני למלך העולם אשר ברוך ומעביר יום ומביא לילה מבדיל בין יום ובין לילה אדוני צבאות שמו אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב הרבים אהבת עולם בית ישראל עמך אהבת תורה מצוות חוקים ומשפטים ואהבתך אל תסיר ממני לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Adonai Elohechem emet, v'emuna kol zol kayam alenu ki Adonai Elohechem. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה בני ישראל לכהנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך בעלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נוראתי לא תוסף אלה מלכותך רוב ובניך בוקר היום לפני משה זה לי ענו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו שלום ועבדנו מקרב ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל לעד ברוך אדוני לעולם אמן ואמן ברוך אדוני הללויה. כי המלכות שלך היא ולעולם תמלך בכבוד כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה ברוך אתה אדוני המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה בהמה דברה קראתי וימליך מלכותי בחיי חונם ובחונם חיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן יהי שמירה וברך לעולם לעולמי יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם וינשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלש מקודשה בריחו להילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה דאמירנה בעלמה ואמרו amen. The whispered Amidah can be found on page 270. If you have not yet finished your Amidah, please continue at your own pace. Kaddish Shalem is on page 280. יתכדה ויקדש שמי רבה, בהמה דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי וחייכון וימיכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל בגלה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה ברך לעולם למי עמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם וינשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה ברכו להילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צלות ההון ובות דכל ישראל קודם ובהון דבי שמיה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום מרמיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עלינו לשבח לאדוני כל התתגלה את סר ראשית שלו עשינו כיועץ. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Mourner's Kaddish, page 282. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמה דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם לומי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה ברכו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. We'll do Havdalah, the next page. The one announcement I'm going to make is that Passover is coming, and if you didn't already know that. And this Thursday, we are going to be doing what we call the Haggadah Slam, and that is a way for the clergy and our residents to take a piece of the Haggadah and really flesh it out for you to be able to learn a little bit more about, and then hopefully take to your own seders. So this year we're going to be doing Pesach Matzah Maror through different through different forms of learning, but also in different chavrutas, one rabbi, one resident. So very excited to be able to do that, and hope you will join us on campus outside 7 p.m. on Thursday. Yanai na nai 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 yanai na nai nai yanai yanai na nai 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 yanai na nai nai yanai nai nai yanai na nai yanai nai nai yana nai 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 yana nai yana na na nai nai hinei el Yeshuati eftach velo efchad ki ozi vezimratia Adonai vayehi li lishua Ushaftem mayim besason mimanei Yeshua L'Adonai Yeshua Alamcha v'irchatecha selam Adonai Tzevaot Imashu Miskav lanu Elohei Yaakov Selah Adonai Tzevaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Ya'aneinu V'yom Koreinu LaYehudim Hayta Ora V'simcha v'sason V'ikar Ken tiyeh lanu Kol Yeshuati tesa, uv'shem Adonai ekra, yainanai, yananai, nai, nai, yainanai, yananai, nai, nai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei vesamim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei me'arei ha'esh. Sorry, I can't lift it up. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshech ben Yisrael le'amim ben yom hashvi'i le'sheshet yamei hamaseh. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, chatoteinu imcho, zareinu v'chasveinu yarbe yarbe kacho, v'kakochavim ala la, zareinu v'chasveinu yarbe yarbe kacho. Kochavim b'layla, Shavua tov, 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 Shavua tov. Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu agiladi, bimera ve'yameinu, yavo eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David. Shavua tov, everyone. Thank you for being here in person and on Zoom, and hope to see you at the Haggadah Slam on Thursday.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do you think you'll be able to record it? Like, did it work on Tuesday, whatever that day was, where you
Thursday?
were doing something in person last week, and you were going to see if you
Yes.
could record it?
It will also be on Zoom, so you'll be able to watch it on Zoom.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Shavua tov.
Shavua tov, everyone. See you soon. Okay. You're so welcome.